wipe them from history. This is one man blamed, Arkan, who ran his own army slaughtering Muslims in the Bosnia War. Today in The Hague, he was indicted by the International War Crimes Tribunal.
I'm hoping that this is sending a sobering signal to all those in Kosovo now who should be under no delusion that they're working behind a veil of darkness because they've kept the world at a distance. They are, I think, collaborative methods that will make sure that what is being perpetrated will be revealed.
Arkan says he's running a football team and nightclub in Belgrade, but it's alleged that he has been involved in massacres in Kosovo. As another aid flight from Britain prepared to leave, news from the Americans that a number of prominent Kosovars who earlier this week were reported to have been executed are in fact alive. They include one of the Paris peace negotiators. This cargo is part of a £10 million relief programme from the British government.
One thing you can be absolutely certain of, the rest of the world, although it's crying tears for these people at the moment, it won't accept them in their homes, it won't accept them in their nations. It'll be very, very hard to find nations who will take Kosovo refugees.
As quickly as they can, the Americans are moving hardware to Britain. And from Washington, news that enough food has been stored to feed 400,000 people for 6 months. The Russians are now moving 7 ships to the Mediterranean, they say, to observe the situation. David Foster, Sky News.
A NATO search overnight intensified at daybreak, with Allied helicopters above the Macedonian frontier, scouring the ground below for any sign of the missing men. Troops retraced the last known position of the US reconnaissance patrol, transmitted under hostile fire on Wednesday afternoon. But despite 20 hours of searching, there was still no sign.
3 US soldiers serving with Task Force Able Sentry, who were on a routine vehicle patrol in rugged terrain north of the town of Kumanovo, reported that they had come under fire. Contact with the patrol was lost and a search was conducted.
It was these stark images on Serbian television that finally provided NATO reason enough to call off the search. Tired and bruised, the 3 American servicemen lost the day before are now in Yugoslav custody. Yugoslavia says they were intercepted inside Serbia. NATO says these troops were on Macedonian territory when they were attacked by a hostile force. Whatever the truth of the matter, the events of the past 24 hours have left NATO forces in Macedonia on heightened alert. NATO has said time and time again that its forces in Macedonia are a peacekeeping, not an aggressive force. President Milosevic has responded by saying that all NATO forces in the region should be considered a military threat. Matthew?
German Tornado jets take off from an air base in Italy, ready for a mission over Yugoslavia. After decades of NATO membership, the conflict in Yugoslavia is the first time since World War II that the German military is going into combat. It's not a premiere that is being celebrated in Germany, but the Bonn government is firmly behind the NATO action, and it is backed by a majority in parliament. But there is growing unease among the Social Democratic and Green parties forming the government coalition. For years, many of them were on the front lines of the peace movement. Their lesson from the horrors of Germany's role in World War II was to look for peaceful means to solve conflicts. And now that Joschka Fischer, a longtime pacifist, is the foreign minister, many question whether the government is right in participating in airstrikes. Fischer reflected this week on the criticism. He spoke of being called a warmonger. He said he wondered whether he had done enough to prevent the airstrikes, but concluded that he could honestly say that, yes, he had tried everything. The foreign minister and his colleagues have only been in office for 6 months. After a rocky start for Gerhard Schröder's government, one newspaper now writes, the cabinet has grown up, and it describes how the burden of this crisis can be seen on their faces. Germany's army is partly made up of draftees, and they are now active in a region where memories of German occupation and war crimes are all too present. The Bonn government speaks of a genocide in Kosovo and says the airstrikes will continue. But sending ground forces could be a very different story. The parliament has ruled that German soldiers could enter Yugoslavia only as peacekeepers under the Rambouillet Peace Treaty. Bettina Lüscher, CNN, Berlin.
Again been laying out the rationale for attacking Slobodan Milosevic's forces.
I hate the idea of having to continue this campaign during this period. But I hate more the idea that we would walk away from this campaign while he continues to clean out house after house after house and village after village after village.
But Mr. Clinton is still saying he has no intention of sending in US ground troops unless there is a peace deal first. Jonathan Hunt, Sky News, Washington.
Forced into exile. The railway station is in the Kosovo capital, its platform crowded with refugees. Men, women and children herded onto trains. They will travel in sealed compartments, conditions better suited to the transport of animals than human beings.
The whole area in front of the station was described by our OSCE employee as being completely a seething mass of humanity, with people being pushed onto the trains, with the platforms being patrolled by people in masks and waving pistols and pistol whipping people as they were getting onto the trains.
On from purely military to other strategic targets. These are the remains of the main road bridge in the town of Novi Sad, north of Belgrade, bombed last night, wrecking the water supply and, it's believed, damaging telecommunications. It's attacks such as this which are reportedly causing a split in the Serbian armed forces. Some are beginning to have doubts about Milosevic's campaign.
Not all his senior commanders want to pay the same price as President Milosevic. We are getting early reports of the sackings of some senior Serbian military commanders, perhaps opposed or troubled by ethnic cleansing, perhaps worried that they also might be indicted for a war crime, perhaps because they are simply honorable men revolted by what they're asked to do.
5 American B-1B bombers have arrived at RAF Fairford in Gloucestershire to bolster NATO forces. They're equipped with radar that can see through cloud cover. Bad weather has hampered bombing raids throughout the campaign. At a NATO briefing in Brussels...
But it's something we have to live with. It's part and parcel of flying aeroplanes, unfortunately.
You are saying that there's been a 75% strike rate so far. That sounds pretty good to those of us who are not in the military world, but just how good is it?
I mean, that's very good. I mean, the accuracy of the weapons we're using is very good. You've seen the video footage that's been put on TV in the past, and you can see that actually when we hit, they are direct hits and a lot of damage will be done.
Had you planned at the beginning for an air campaign that was going to go on as long as this, and in fact probably is going to go on for several weeks more?
Yes, I mean the campaign, that's for our political masters, our military commanders. Our task here is obviously to play our part in it. The pilots are all focused on the task, and yes, it is sustainable. We've sized the detachment here to ensure that we can sustain it for as long as is necessary.
We're into this much heralded phase 3 at the moment. Seemingly, though, things have slowed down recently.
Yes, I think I mean the weather has obviously hampered operations, as you well know. The changes of the phases of the operation to us really are just a change of emphasis on target. For the rest of it, for the planning and the way we conduct our missions, it doesn't really make much difference to us. We will be tasked against various targets, and that's what we'll concentrate on.
Have your men seen the pictures of the American soldiers who've been captured?
Yes, we have.
What is the reaction there? How distressing do they find it?
Obviously, it's a worry when you see that sort of thing on TV, but as we saw the other day with the downing of the 117 stealth fighter, again, there was a concern there, but what was very reassuring was how quickly the procedures that are in place managed to get the pilot out. So that in itself was very reassuring.
So the morale amongst your crews is high, is it, at the moment?
The morale's very good, not just amongst the crews, but amongst everybody on the detachment. We've got a large detachment, approximately 300 people, lots of support personnel who are also vital to the operation, and morale's very good, yes.
I've been reading that the kind of precision you're getting with your strike rate is much better than a decade ago. Can you just tell us, go a little bit technical on us and explain why?
I think clearly as time moves on, technology improves, and what we've got in service now is of a fairly recent technology, and is clearly better than we had available 10 years ago. I wouldn't like to go into too much detail, but as you're aware, we're using precision-guided munitions, laser-guided bombs, and a lot of those options weren't available 10 years ago.
How much interaction is there with aircraft from other countries?
A lot. We are merely one small element of a large NATO coalition, and the packages of aircraft that are put together are really put together to give self-protection to each other, and we are just one part of a large coalition. So we're very dependent on other nations as well.
RAF Wing Commander.
Though doubtless with more caution. The three, part of a UN peacekeeping force in Macedonia, had been travelling in only a lightly armoured vehicle when they went missing. Their last radio contact said they were being fired at and were surrounded.
It does have to be said.
Carries massive political risk. The three soldiers now in Yugoslav hands are simply pawns in a bigger game. Stephen Sacker, BBC News, Washington.
And Stephen joins. Is a so far small but vocal and violent opposition to the bombings to the north. The US Embassy was attacked last week, and there have been demonstrations by some of the 40,000 ethnic Serbs who are part of the potentially explosive ethnic mix here. An incident like today's was the last thing NATO or the Macedonian government needed. Keith Graves, Sky News, Skopje.
This evening,
as NATO achieved in the past week. At NATO headquarters, the Supreme Allied Commander was talking about the targets they have hit. In the first nights, the raids were principally on air defence sites across Yugoslavia. By the fifth night, he said, there was a much stronger concentration on targets in the south of Serbia and in Kosovo.
Step by step, day by day.
Overall, after 8 nights, NATO can show a lot of flashes on its target map, but little apparent progress in persuading Mr. Milosevic to relent.
I believe that NATO attacks have done substantial damage to these instruments of oppression. The leadership of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia seems to remain short-sighted and defiant. Perhaps they're in denial.
So, how does the campaign proceed from here? NATO's only answer at the moment, with a ground offensive still firmly ruled out, is to threaten more of the same. New aircraft are being committed to the attack. These are American B-1 bombers arriving today in Britain. We have the stamina, says NATO, and the determination to continue. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News.
Political environment that the strikes are taking place in is becoming more complicated. Julian Mannion, ITN, Belgrade.
The border between Kosovo and Macedonia. They were 200 metres inside Macedonia, near the small Serb village of Nagoricana. As Colin Baker now reports, the villagers may have played a part in their capture.
The Americans patrol one of the most sensitive border regions, mobile and on foot. 2 weeks ago, the Serbs moved 20,000 troops into this area, but NATO says these patrols are purely routine security measures. Using night vision, this American patrol last night searched the frontier for any sign of their missing comrades. And then this morning, we found the village where they were taken. It is on the Macedonia side, but this is a Serb village, and NATO here are the enemy. It is possible on these unmarked roads to cross the border accidentally, but these were NATO soldiers with NATO maps and satellite navigation equipment. If they didn't cross it accidentally, then the suspicion must be that they were taken with the help of these local Serb villagers. The 3 Americans were behind the church on the hill. They reported being fired on and then surrounded, possibly by Serbs in the village. One boasted to us today that he was part of the operation, and they would take more captive tonight, he said. Not far away, the local sentiments are clearly expressed. These warning signs should indicate to NATO the need for extreme caution. The search was intense, troops massed along the border, helicopters flying the frontier, a vast area to cover, and time always running out. so too were the possibilities as one by one sectors were cleared.
We know they're not out here, so we're not going to continue to search out here.
And then the news came. The Serbs had them.
Some of the alternatives, I'm glad to know they're alive.
And so they left. One of their patrols is missing, but more will be out tonight. Colin Baker, ITN, on the Macedonia-Kosovo border.
B-1 bombers. The supersonic bombers can carry 20 cruise missiles and will operate together with the B-52 bombers already flying from the base. And in Moscow, the Russian President Boris Yeltsin continued to speak out against the NATO attacks. Today, he called for an emergency meeting of leading foreign ministers to discuss the crisis. He said he was considering sending more warships to the Mediterranean. RAF Tornadoes equipped with laser-guided bombs are preparing to make the first flights from RAF Bruggen in Germany to attack Serb targets. The ITV Evening News has exclusive pictures of their final training mission. Kevin Dunn reports from Bruggen.
RAF Tornadoes taking off into clear blue skies. ITN flew with them today on a training mission, but their next sorties may be bombing raids into Serbia. There, the flying conditions will not be so kind, and the pilots could well be flying into anti-aircraft fire and possibly surface-to-air missiles. They will operate from RAF Bruggen in Germany, so they will need to refuel several times mid-flight. When they do, the aircraft hover around the mother tanker like impatient kittens at feeding time. For every pilot and every plane, it is a highly practiced and skilled maneuver. On the ground, the Tornadoes are at their highest state of readiness. When NATO decided 2 days ago to beef up its operations in the air campaign against Yugoslavia, 4 of these Tornado aircraft were immediately assigned to NATO forces. Today, 4 more have been declared fully operational and ready for missions over Serbia. The Tornadoes deliver bombs which are guided to their targets by this laser pod, the plane's so-called Magic Eye.
Well, this is the clever bit on the airplane, apart from the crew in the cockpit. But of course, the bomb sees the reflected laser energy and guides itself to the target.
That is, provided the weather is good. They will be hoping for clear skies too over Serbia. Kevin Dunn, ITN, at RAF Bruggen in Germany.
We have more tops.
Nations to get together to work on the crisis. The appeal is backed by the threat of Russian ships being sent to the Mediterranean. Russia is sending its most menacing signals yet of stronger measures to frustrate NATO's campaign in Kosovo. The Black Sea Fleet in Sebastopol is preparing a flotilla of 7 ships, including 1 reconnaissance vessel. NATO countries will fear that this kind of high-tech information gatherer might provide Yugoslavia with eyes and ears in the Adriatic. The escalation of Russia's diplomatic pressure comes only a day after President Yeltsin made a conspicuous visit to the neighboring Republic of the Ukraine, which still controls much of the nuclear hardware of the former Soviet Union. The Russian leadership is unlikely to go to war over Yugoslavia, but they have continued diplomatic protests over NATO's involvement. Today, President Yeltsin called for an emergency meeting of the foreign ministers from the group of 8 industrialized nations to stop the bombing of Kosovo. With its diplomacy looking tired, Russia has clearly toughened its approach. During exercises in the Barents Sea today, the Russian Navy claimed it had spotted a watching US submarine. The Serbs must be wondering if the hint of muscle will have any more impact on NATO countries than Russia's soft talking. Well, earlier I spoke...
Any operation that is going to bring ordnance from the air onto the ground is normally controlled by a close air support team. And, of course, there is no close air support team in there.
Ideally, ground-based forward controllers would guide pilots to small specific targets difficult to pinpoint from the air. But NATO nations refuse to confirm or deny whether there is a clandestine NATO military presence in Kosovo. Meanwhile, NATO says it has gathered firm evidence Yugoslav demolition squads are blowing up houses to simulate NATO bombing. General Clark says there is no sanctuary for those responsible for attacks on Kosovar civilians.
We are all
maintaining their positions in northern Macedonia. These troops came as United Nations observers, monitoring the volatile Yugoslavian frontier. The UN mission's been closed down, but these men and women of the 4th Cavalry Regiment are continuing their reconnaissance mission under the US flag. On what NATO is calling a routine reconnaissance patrol in Macedonia, these 3 US servicemen ran into hostile fire and fell into the custody of the Yugoslav authorities. In these stark pictures, the 3 appeared tired and bruised. NATO says they may be enduring something of an ordeal.
We're very concerned about the safety and welfare of the 3 soldiers who were abducted by Serb forces. We've all seen their pictures. We don't like it.
Before the pictures were broadcast on Serbian television, NATO had been conducting an intensive search after losing radio contact with the US patrol around Macedonia's rugged Yugoslavian frontier. Macedonia has long been...
Weather busting. You remember, of course, that the weather has hampered RAF Harriers in locking onto their target. So these are pictures just in of B-1Bs taking off from RAF Fairford in Gloucestershire.
The Mediterranean, but they did complain they thought an American submarine was monitoring their exercises. This mobilization...
European NATO officer, a cock-up. The captured soldiers had strayed from the 3-vehicle patrol and were caught by the Serbs on their own. NATO mounted a token search, but already knew from the soldiers' desperate radio calls what had happened. That did not lessen the shock and anger at their television appearance. First, the warning.
Any soldiers captured must be treated in accordance with international law, and remind everybody that NATO would expect that to be done.
And then the threat.
We've all seen their pictures. We don't like it. We don't like the way they're treated, and we have a long memory about these kinds of things.
But the implications go further than the plight of 3 soldiers. But as their hoped-for peacekeeping role in Kosovo has failed to materialize, and they've taken on the appearance of the vanguard of a possible invasion force, their welcome has worn thin. NATO leaders stressed that the force poses no threat to the Serbs. But they, and some Macedonians who've been...
The capture was the focus of conversation.
There was a lot of concern. I think there was a lot of prayers that went out for the safe return of the servicemen as well as to their families.
Prisoners of war.
Pilot reporters that his squadron has, for the most part, been able to precisely drop their bombs.
Weather could be a factor, but basically the targets the aircraft have been pretty successful in coming back with having destroyed their target.
In fact, many of the planes here are capable of accurately delivering bombs from high altitudes, whatever the cloud cover, although it can present dangers. Even in the very worst weather, Air Force officers say, some of their laser-guided weaponry can still be deadly accurate. But it requires the very risky presence behind enemy lines of forward spotters who can pinpoint the targets with their laser beams. In the end, though, pilots may soon have both their high technology and good cloud condition. Meteorologists are predicting the weather may start slowly improving over the weekend. Jim Bitterman, CNN, Aviano.
Today, the Foreign Secretary, Robin Cook, said there were signs that the Yugoslav military hierarchy was under strain. But the paramilitary leader, known as Arkan, who's been named as a suspected war criminal, said any ground troops sent into Kosovo would be sent home in body bags.
US warplanes take to the skies above Yugoslavia again tonight. There are airstrikes around the clock. And as the early warning sirens wail out over Belgrade, these latest pictures from local television show their devastating impact on the ground. These are the shattered remains of a main road bridge in the town of Novi Sad, north of Belgrade. NATO believes the first cracks are now appearing as well in the Yugoslav military leadership.
We are getting early...
Burner. Interestingly enough, when Ken Bacon was asked in a press conference only an hour ago, and these photos are 2 hours ago, what was the state of the B-1s, he said he didn't know, which I thought was quite interesting. But a number have taken off. One assumes they're going to head on the most direct routes towards Yugoslavia and will be doing their radar guided attacks through the clouds on targets in Kosovo.
And I suppose one of the beauties is that they can carry an enormous amount of armament.
The armament is huge. Also, the type of weapons they used in the Operation Desert Fox are satellite-guided bombs, so hopefully greater accuracy.
They've been joined now by more F-117s.
Yes, there was a request from NATO to send more F-117s, the stealth fighter, one of which, of course, was shot down about a week ago. 12 more, that should bring the number up to about 24. This tends to show they want to increase the precision attacks over the more dangerous parts